Blake struggled to get through the front door. His body was heavy with fatigue after another grueling day. His hands were blistered and his head ached. He was a construction project manager. His job was to solve problems, but once the problems were solved, he often gave his energies to carpentry. Home was his sanctuary, his happy place. Once inside, however, he knew immediately that something was wrong. There was a suitcase standing by the door. Blake froze in place. Then his gaze fell on Susan. She was sitting on the edge of the couch, her posture unusually straight and her expression more cheerful than it should have been. "Don't worry," she said in an exaggeratedly cheerful voice. "I'm not leaving you." Blake blinked, trying to collect his thoughts. His silence was reflexive. All his experience had taught him to keep his mouth shut and listen when the situation started to get complicated, and his intuition told him that this situation was appropriate. Confused, and with a growing sense that something terrible was happening, he tossed his keys on the side table. "I just wanted to deal with this first," Susan continued, standing up. Her nervous energy was evident in her movements. She smiled, broadly, even excitedly, but there was something off about it. It was too strained. "This is going to sound, well, bad at first, but I have to tell you." Blake's gaze darted to the suitcase, and his mind began to piece together facts he didn't want to admit. "What's going on?" he finally asked in a voice hoarse with fatigue and confusion. Susan took a deep breath like a person would before delivering good news. "I'm going away for a week," she said with excessive eagerness. "With Roger." For a moment there was silence in the room. Blake stood as if his body had forgotten how to move and react. Roger? Her boss? The arrogant jerk who seemed to think everyone else was beneath him? This Roger? "Leaving with Roger," said Blake in an even voice. Not a question, not a statement. Rather, it was simply a generalization of what he had gleaned from the conversation. Susan hurriedly continued with a mixture of guilt and excitement. I know. It sounds bad at first, but I don't think it is. I've been seeing him for a while, but that's not the point." She stepped closer, and there was an almost childlike lightheartedness shining in her eyes, as if she was confessing something embarrassing but exciting. "The thing is, I didn't plan it. I mean, it's Roger. He's Roger. You know how he is. He wanted me, and, well, I couldn't say no. He's so, persuasive, you know? Once he decides he wants something, he gets it." She let out a quiet, almost soundless laugh. "And he wanted me." Blake stared at her. His mind tried to keep track of what she was saying. She was talking about Roger as if he was a force of nature, something inevitable. And her tone, the way she seemed almost proud? It was unreal. Those words echoed in Blake's head, empty and strange. It also seemed like Blake was completely inconsistent in this case. "But that's why I'm telling you," she continued, and her voice became more serious. "I didn't want to keep it from you anymore. I feel so much better. It's just talking about it, you know? No more secrets. It was like a weight lifted off my shoulders, and I didn't want to lie about the trip." She pointed to the suitcase. "Roger and I are going away for a week. He's, he thinks it would be good for us to really enjoy each other without hiding, you know, just being together." Blake opened his mouth but couldn't get a word out. His thoughts were like a whirlwind, and his emotions were beginning to stir. He couldn't understand, couldn't fathom how real this was. How Susan could stand before him so excited, so at ease, talking about something that had destroyed the very essence of their marriage. "But don't worry," Susan added quickly, her face brightening again. "It's only for a week. After that, we'll be back to normal.'I'll come back to you, Blake. I love you. There's no reason for this to come between us. This," she waved her hands as if dismissing the whole situation, "it's just an accident, a little hiccup. Roger just wanted me. And now that he has me, we'll only be gone a week and I'll be back. Then we can really focus on us, on building our family." Blake's heart hammered hard in his chest. His ears were ringing. How could she be so upbeat, so bright and happy? She'd talked about her infidelity as if it meant nothing, as if Blake meant nothing at all. The way she talked about Roger, as if he was some important person, just didn't make any sense. Susan was clearly infatuated with Roger. She just accepted it because what else could she do? It was Roger. I know this may come as a shock, but you're always so understanding, Blake. That's one of the reasons I love you. You're poised. You never make a fuss, and that's why I know we'll get through this. She stepped closer, holding out a folded piece of paper. Roger and I have talked about this, just to make it go smoothly, you know. We wrote something down. A guide for you. Blake stared at the piece of paper in her hand, and his mind went numb. Susan held the list out to him. It wasn't anything special, really. Just a few pointers to make sure everything is in order while I'm gone. His hands shook as he unfolded the paper. Some of the phrases were crisp and clear. 1. No arguments before or after the trip. We all want to keep calm. 2. No telling anyone about what we are doing. 3. No social media posts about any of this. 4. No talking about divorce or separation. It's just an affair. 5. Don't ask about the details of the trip afterward. 6. Wait calmly at home until the trip is over and then focus on the future. Family plans should remain the same as previously discussed. Blake felt his breath catch. No arguments. No saying anything to anyone. No divorce. He couldn't accept such impertinence, the assumption that he would simply submit while his wife spent a week with another man. The insolence of these two cheaters was unbelievable and naive. Susan's voice interrupted his silence. See? Nothing out of the ordinary, just a couple of simple things to make sure everything will be all right. Roger thinks very highly of you, you know? He said you're gonna be fine. It might be hard, but soon it'll be over, and we'll be back to the way things were. You're not the jealous type, Blake. You're practical. I know it's hard, but it's gonna be okay. You're not gonna make a big deal out of this, are you? There was hope in her wide-open eyes, almost pleading. But behind it was confidence, absolute faith that everything would be okay, because of course Blake wouldn't make trouble. Of course he wouldn't argue. He was her rock. Divorce wasn't even possible. Not in her world. Blake's hands clenched over her list. His brain demanded he say something, anything at all. But he had no words. What could he say? Susan smiled, taking his silence as agreement. I knew you'd understand, she said quietly, a look of relief on her face. I was so nervous, but you always gave me what I needed. You've always been there for me, and you always will be. She leaned over and gave him a quick peck on the cheek. I'll be back next Friday afternoon, she said, picking up her suitcase and bouncing merrily. Then everything will be back to normal, and we can talk about starting a family, okay? Blake watched her walk out the door, stop and turn to him with such a beaming smile, as if everything in the world was right with the world. Then she was gone. Blake stood, clutching the folded list in his fist. It was almost amusing. Guidance. Like his actions were something they could control, something they could dictate and control with a few simple rules, as if it wasn't his marriage they'd shredded. For a second, he froze. His mind was still in shock, but then something began to burn through him. A fire was igniting inside him, and it wasn't confusion or heartbreak. It was rage, and it was growing. Blake had always had a knack for troubleshooting. When the situation called for it, he could be a negotiator and solve any problem. If tough action was required, he did it without a second thought. He could do whatever the situation demanded once he determined what was required of him. What he was feeling was familiar to him. It was a problem that required a certain approach, but not one that Roger and Susan could appreciate. He looked over the list once more. What chutzpah and what arrogance! To think they had any hope of keeping him under control. It was foolish to seriously assume that he would do as he was told and play his assigned role. Susan thought things would go back to normal when she returned. He could almost hear Roger's voice imposing conditions as if this was some kind of game. Blake reread the list once more and began to smile. For Susan and Roger, it was a matter of restrictions, of hedges, of making sure there were no complications. It was all about how they managed it, and how they kept it in check. Blake had a different point of view. This list made it clear what they were worried about, what they feared, and what he could do. In his hands, this wasn't some contract. It was a spark, a beginning. If they were going to give him a list, well, he could come up with something better. Much better. His smile, grim and wicked, spread across his face as the pieces of the mosaic began to fall into place. His mind sharpened. Blake wasn't the type to break down into a scream or throw things. No, his anger was never loud. Blake's anger was quiet, methodical. He built his career solving problems, and this betrayal, was his biggest problem by far. How do you solve big problems? Step by step. Their list was too short and too naive. It didn't cover half of what needed to be done. He would make a much more thorough plan. He strode into the kitchen, tossed their pathetic list on the table, jerked open a drawer, and pulled out a notepad and pen. He was on a kick. Now his brain was starting to work. He knew how to solve problems. It was time to solve the problem with the unfaithful wife and her sleazy boss. He would solve it the same way he solved everything else, by being 10 steps ahead. His new list would not be pleasant. It wasn't going to be short. Blake's new to-do list: 1. Freeze all joint accounts. Blake kept all the accounts. He always took care of all the finances. He wasn't abusive, but he didn't make it easy for her either. All automatic payments, deposits, or joint accounts would be closed. Her money would remain untouched, but his money would be inaccessible to her. 2. Change the locks. When she returns, her key will no longer fit. This house, their home, no longer belonged to her. She had made her choice and could knock on Roger's door if she needed lodging. She would find nothing here. 3. Sell the house. There were too many memories here, and it wasn't worth worrying about keeping them. He would put the house up for sale while she was gone and not think about it again. By the time Susan returned, the house would no longer be his problem as much as hers. 4. Pack up her things. All her things would go into storage. He will, of course, pack it all up neatly and leave it for her to pick up later. Clothes, trinkets, pictures. All the things that tied her to him will be packed up and put away. He would even move all their furniture with her. He would start a new life somewhere else. He didn't need any reminders. 5. Gather evidence. Susan took her phone with her, but Blake took care of all her tech needs. He would buy a new phone for her number and restore it using Susan's cloud account. All of her messages, emails, and photos would be in his hands. The phone she could use to contact Blake would stop working, but she could deal with that when she got back. 6. Talk to a lawyer. Divorce was not on the agenda. It was a solvable issue. Blake would find the best lawyer in town and handle the paperwork. No separation or divorce? Be realistic. 7. Talk to Roger's wife. They were counting on Blake to keep quiet and keep the peace. But why did he have to keep quiet? Roger might be used to being in command, but Blake had no incentive to cooperate. He would be sure to share all the evidence he expected to find, now that he knew to start looking. 8. Focus on the future, because this isn't the end of Blake's life. It's just the end of Susan's place in it. He would leave town and start a new life somewhere else. He wouldn't waste his time being bitter. For the moment, he would focus on this list. Blake leaned back, tapping his pen on the paper. It was a good feeling to plan. He wasn't going to beg. He wasn't going to fight for something that was already ruined. No, he was going to take control in a way that neither Susan nor Roger could have foreseen. He was taking his life from people who thought they had free reign over it. He had his own plan. By the time Susan returned, the world she thought she had would be long gone. Blake stood in the middle of the empty living room. The house was empty now. Everything had been put away. Not just Susan's things. Everything was gone. Her clothes, shoes, and even small knickknacks were packed and neatly stacked in one of the 2 storage drawers outside. His own belongings lay in the other drawer, ready for whatever came next. His buddies helped him move everything without asking questions. They all knew the story by then, but they didn't pry. They just did what was necessary in exchange for pizza and beer. It was the easiest thing to do. Physical work had always come easy to Blake. Sweat, muscle, determination, he could handle it. The hardest part was keeping his mind clear. Over the past few days, he'd experienced a whirlwind of emotions. Betrayal, rage, and disbelief all simmered beneath the surface. He was strung out to the max, expecting an explosion. But he couldn't. Not yet. Blake took one last look around the house. It was no longer a house, just a shell. The walls seemed thinner and the air colder. The house had been scrubbed from top to bottom. Every trace of their life together had been wiped away. His foot would never set foot here again, and the thought seemed right. Now everything was ruined. And then there was the name. That lovely irony. His house. The house they never bothered to put her name on. Susan had lived here, played in this house, but it had never belonged to her. He grinned bitterly. She probably didn't even think about it. She'd just assumed that she and Blake would stay there forever. She'd been wrong. His lawyer had been diligent and had clearly drawn up the divorce papers. No long conversations, no drama. Blake wasn't going to drag this out. The papers were prepared and ready to be filed the minute she got back. If she came back. He didn't care about that anymore. Whether she returned to the house she'd sold or stayed with Roger forever didn't matter. It was Susan's phone that took the most effort. She had, of course, taken it with her when she and Roger went somewhere. But Susan had always been careless about her passwords and trusted Blake for everything. And why shouldn't she? He was loyal to her. An immutable rock she took for granted. He sat down at the kitchen table, staring coldly and intently at the recovered phone in his hand. It looked exactly like her phone, because it was. He'd remotely disconnected her service, changed her phone, and restored everything from her cloud backup. It was almost too easy. And he found everything he needed. Her correspondence with Roger had been so disgusting. Not just the affair itself, which Blake was already ready for, but the way it was talked about. Roger, smug as ever, brushing Blake aside, believing him to be no threat. He's too nice. He'll get over it. Blake could practically hear the arrogance in the printed words. Susan's answers hurt even more. He'll be fine. He won't make a fuss. He never does. He felt bile come up to his throat, but swallowed it down. He won't make a fuss. That was exactly how she saw him. Not as a partner, not as a man she respected, but as a doormat. A man too weak to stand up for himself. There were pictures, too. Of course there were pictures. Apparently Roger liked to take pictures of Susan giving him pleasure and then send them to her. Blake wondered what kind of person could have done that. Roger had even sent her an email confirming their trip, gloating about how smart he was. Blake's lips curled contemptuously. They were careless, arrogant, and they thought they were invincible. All of it put together was a magnificent presentation. The reports, the photos, all the evidence of their connection. It was all documented, neatly organized, and shared, not only to his divorce attorney, but also to Roger's wife. Also to the board of directors Roger worked under, and a slightly corrected version was shared on social media. He wanted it to go public and not be blocked for nudity. He made a significant effort to share the news with absolutely everyone who knew Susan or Roger. Blake had thoroughly dealt with Roger's wife's case. It wasn't about revenge. Not really, but this woman deserved to know. She was entitled to the truth, just as he was. And amazingly enough, she was too kind, in fact. The silence on the other end of the wire threw him off balance, but he tried to ignore it. He'd done his part, shared everything he'd managed to gather with her via email. Whatever happened to her next was up to her and her scumbag husband. Blake was going to leave them with nothing. Susan thought she could go back to her life, Blake, and their plans for a family. Roger thought he could walk away unscathed, as if none of this would affect him. Blake wasn't going to let that happen. Susan was nervous, but also in high spirits as the trip began. Roger had planned everything: first-class flights to Italy, a luxurious hotel room, and dinners at the best restaurants. He had won her over with his splendor. For a while it was intoxicating to be desired by a man like Roger. A man who ruled every room he was in, made her feel special, part of something much bigger. Roger wanted her, and that meant something, didn't it? The first night they checked into the hotel, and everything seemed perfect. Roger ordered champagne, which was already waiting for them in their room, and they laughed, clinked glasses, and spent the evening in bed. The view of the city lights through the massive windows was breathtaking. Susan allowed herself to be carried away by this fascination and this romance. On the second day, things began to change. At first, it was slight. Roger was still attentive, but seemed somehow detached. It was evident in his eyes that the novelty of their escape was beginning to wear off for him. Susan laughed at something he said over a cocktail, but Roger didn't laugh back. He just smiled a thin, dismissive smile that she could see he used on employees he considered beneath him. She didn't bother to object. Perhaps he was tired or distracted by something. Susan left her phone on the bedside table, turning it on as a charger for the small watch. She didn't try to call Blake or text him. She missed him, but felt he wouldn't want to talk to her the moment she was with Roger. She was a little annoyed at Blake for not sending a single text to check on her. It didn't matter, though. Roger needed all of her attention as long as she was with him. The next day, Roger took her shopping at several designer boutiques, exclusive stores that she had always wanted to visit but never decided to. But Roger fit in perfectly. That evening, he bought her a dress for dinner. For a moment, she thought she was in some kind of fairy tale, that they were living a glamorous secret life. But as the evening wore on, Roger became more and more aloof. He spent most of dinner checking his phone, nodding occasionally when she spoke, but never really socializing. The waitresses fawned over him, and Susan found herself hiding in his shadow, more as an accomplice than a partner. That night as they lay in bed, Roger fell asleep almost immediately, turning his back to her. Susan turned to the phone, feeling a strange prick of guilt mixed with longing. Blake hadn't called or texted. She wasn't sure if that was a relief or a disappointment. By the fourth day, he'd almost lost interest in her outside of the bedroom. He still flaunted her at lunches, introducing her to coworkers or other acquaintances as if she were some sort of prize. She suddenly realized that there had never been any warmth between them. She had always been nothing more than a toy to him, just another pretty face to show off, just another notch on the bedpost. He barely spoke to her except during meals, and when they were in the room, he either used her or just ignored her. At one point, he brought 2 other women into the room. He barely looked at Susan when they entered. Susan was shocked, but Roger hardly noticed her concern. He informed her that if she wasn't going to join the 3 of them in bed, she could sleep on the couch. It was then that the gravity of the situation finally dawned on her. She spent that night curled up and staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out when everything had gone wrong. It wasn't at all what she'd imagined. Roger wanted her. He'd chosen her. But now what? Now she felt like she was just part of the setting, expendable. The next morning, Susan tried to talk to him, to tell him how she felt and to ask if everything was all right, if there was anything she could do, but he coldly brushed her off. "Don't be dramatic, Susan. This trip is just fun." She smiled weakly and nodded, but something inside snapped. It wasn't fun. It wasn't exciting anymore. She missed Blake and the stability of her real life. Blake looked at her like she was the center of his world. Next to Roger, she felt like nothing more than a secondary figure. On the 6th day, things got really bad. He didn't like her, and he had never really liked her. He cared about how she looked in his arms, the excitement of sex, his power over her. But Susan herself was just another thing for him to use. In that moment, she realized how foolish she had been, thinking this week would be something magical and something meaningful. She was just a toy for this man. On the last night, Susan reached for the phone. She was going to call Blake and see how he was doing, but when she looked at her phone, she realized something was wrong. It was fully charged, but there was no connection or notifications. She hadn't gotten a single text from Blake. No missed calls, no texts. She assumed Blake would be waiting for her, that he would understand and that everything would be okay when she got home. Now she wasn't so sure. Why hadn't he called, just once? She tried calling him from the hotel phone, but for some reason it wouldn't connect to Blake's number. The return trip brought Susan relief. Susan couldn't wait to leave. The luxury, the glitz, it all seemed so fake and so empty. The glitter was gone, and she wanted to go home. She missed Blake. She missed his warmth, his kindness, his stability. She missed the fact that with him she always felt secure. With a heavy heart, Susan stared out the porthole as the plane descended. She was ashamed and confused at how much she had allowed herself to immerse herself in Roger's world. Now the fantasy had shattered, and all that was left was a feeling of emptiness. Roger was just a selfish and cold man who had used her. Susan realized that she now knew what it was like to be a whore. She had become a slut for Roger. She began to cry quietly. All she wanted was to be in Blake's arms again, to be back where everything made sense. She wanted to tell Blake how much she missed him. She imagined coming home, falling to her knees and apologizing. He would forgive her. He always did. He had to. Susan pulled to the curb in front of her house. Her heart was racing with excitement and fear. The trip had been a mistake, and she finally realized it. Roger was not the man she thought he was, and everything that had happened in the past week seemed like a bad dream. But all of that was behind her. All she could think about was seeing Blake, falling into his arms and telling him she was sorry. She would explain everything. They'd talk, and then they'd move on with their lives. They'd start over. But when she got out of the car, she saw a bright, garish "for sale" sign on the front lawn. Her stomach twisted. For sale? It couldn't be. Blake hadn't said a word about selling the house. Why would he do that? They had plans. Sure, there were problems to be solved, but they could fix everything. There must be some kind of mistake. Already confused by this sign, she fumbled for her keys. The key slid into the lock but wouldn't turn. Confused, she tried again. It wouldn't budge. She tried jerking it, pulled it out and put it in again, but still nothing worked. Why wasn't it working? "Blake!" she called, knocking on the door with increasing insistence. "Blake, are you in here? It's me." No one answered. Her voice echoed on the other side of the door. Susan's heart did somersaults as she went to the window and peered inside. The house was empty. There was absolutely nothing there. No furniture, no paintings, no sign that anyone had ever lived there. "Blake?" she whispered. This wasn't some big misunderstanding. Something was wrong. She reached for the phone and dialed Blake's number. The screen came to life, but it wasn't right. Her phone wasn't connecting. The screen just flashed an error message. No service. Susan was stunned. She scrolled through the settings to check the signal. Nothing. It was as if her phone had been disconnected. She then tried to call her parents, but the same error popped up. She was completely unable to reach anyone. What the hell? She got back in the car and with shaky hands started the engine. Blake will explain everything, she thought. He wouldn't just leave. The drive to her parents' house passed like a blur as she tried to find an explanation where Blake would make things right. Maybe there had been some kind of mistake with the house? Maybe Blake had left for work and forgot to tell her? Maybe. When she pulled up to her parents' house, she barely had time to turn off the engine before she rushed to the front door. Her mother opened the door before she could knock, and her face was tense with worry. "Susan," her mother said in a strained voice, "where have you been? We've been trying to contact you." Susan swallowed hard. "There's something wrong with my phone. I couldn't call anyone. What's going on, Mom? Blake, he changed the locks. The house is empty. What's going on?" Her mother sighed heavily and stepped aside, letting Susan inside. "You better sit down." "I don't want to sit around. I want to know what's going on." Susan's voice shook with panic. "Why can't I get in touch with Blake? Why is our house on the market?" Her father came into the room, a look of quiet sadness on his face. "Blake's gone, Susan. He left town. The house is for sale. Your things are in storage." The words hit her chest like a sledgehammer, and she suddenly found it hard to breathe. Gone? Her mind struggled to comprehend what she was being told. Blake had left? Put the house up for sale? Why hadn't he told her? Why hadn't he called? "What do you mean he'd left?" Susan's voice shook, and the pounding of her heart echoed in her ears. "He wouldn't just leave me. He wouldn't. He loves me." Her parents exchanged glances that only increased her anxiety. Her mother sat down beside her and placed her palm soothingly on her shoulder. "Susan, he's not coming back. Blake called us a couple days ago and told us that you'd left with someone else and that he was done with you. He put your stuff in storage and the house is for sale. He filed for divorce." Susan blinked, trying to make sense of what was being said. This couldn't be real. Divorce? No, Blake wouldn't. He couldn't. He loved her. They had to make things right. She'd made a mistake, but they could fix it. He just couldn't. Did he say it was over? She asked, lowering her voice almost to a whisper. Just like that? Her father nodded solemnly. He said you knew what you were doing when you left with that man. That it was your choice. And now it's his choice. Susan stared at him. She had assumed Blake would be waiting for her, as always, with his usual calm. No matter what she did, he would be there for her, calm and patient, ready to take her back. But now he was gone, and it was her fault. Nay! She covered her face with her hands brimming with hot tears. I didn't mean for this to happen, she squeezed out. I didn't mean... He shouldn't have left, I thought... You thought Blake would just forgive you, her mother said quietly, but not hostilely. But Susan, you hurt him. How could you do that? The sobs grew stronger and Susan shook her head. She was overcome with disbelief and regret. Blake had been her pillar and the foundation for her, but she had taken him for granted, thinking he would love her no matter what. She'd thought she could play with fire and not get burned. Now she was standing on the ashes of her ruined life. Have you tried calling him? Her father asked quietly. Susan nodded. She was still covering her face with her hands. The connection doesn't go through. I think he must have changed his number. I can't get in touch with him. Her mother nodded. He was done. He didn't want to contact us anymore. Susan jumped to her feet and started pacing frantically around the room. No, this can't be happening. I have to talk to him. He'll understand. He must understand. But as soon as she said those words, reality finally began to clear. Blake was gone. Really gone. And there was nothing she could say or do to fix that. She sank back into her chair, her hands shaking. I never thought it would end like this, she whispered, more to herself than to her parents. I never thought it would. But deep down, she knew. She'd let Roger take her, let herself believe that it was forgivable, that Blake would be there waiting for her to come to her senses. She'd put everything on the line, thinking she wouldn't lose. And now it was beginning to dawn on her that she had lost. Her phone lay on the coffee table, dead and disconnected, just as she thought her life was now. Gone was the house, gone was her husband, and gone was the future with Blake she'd dreamed of.